Let us turn in our Bibles to the book of Genesis and chapter 29. The book of Genesis and chapter 29. Although we live at a time when travelling is so easy, we are still, for some reason, fascinated with other people's travels from the dim and distant past, when travelling was not so easy. For example, Michael Portillo has spent hours retracing the train journeys of a man in the 19th century called, does anybody know his name? Bradshaw, George Bradshaw. You can tell the programmes that John watches on television. Michael Palin, this would be my preference, Michael Palin launched the first of his fascinating travel programmes in 1988 with a series called Around the World in 80 Days, and he too was retracing the travels of someone from the 19th century. The difference being that he was retracing the steps of a fictional character. Does anybody know that name? Phileas Fogg. Yes, that's right. And although travel has become so easy for us, so easy compared with Bradshaw or Phileas Fogg, we are still fascinated by those who made their epic journeys when travelling was far from easy. And so that being the case, we may have turned to Genesis 29, hoping to hear more, hoping to hear about the next instalment in Jacob's incredible journey. You may remember in chapter 28, verse 10, we read of him leaving Beersheba in the south of Canaan and setting out for Haran in the northeast up in Mesopotamia. That was a journey of 500 miles, don't forget. And having read in the remainder of chapter 28 about his fascinating experience at Bethel, which was only 50 miles in, don't forget, we might have been expecting to read of many more fascinating experiences along the way. From Bethel, there's another 450 miles to go. Surely there were many exciting things that happened over the remaining miles. Surely there's plenty of stories that could be told about where he got his water from each day. Stories told about where he got his food each day. Stories told about where he slept, who he met, what wild animals he encountered along the way, and so we could go on. Michael Portillo and Michael Palin could no doubt produce a 10-part series retracing this man's journey. Well, if you're someone who loves retracing the steps of a traveller from a previous era, then I hope you're not too disappointed as we turn to chapter 29. I say that because as we turn to this chapter, his journey is virtually over. It's done. That's how Old Testament narrative often works. Have you noticed that? Several months and even years can be covered in a single sentence. But then it's as if the camera slows right down and whole chapters can be spent on a single incident. The pace is not the same. It speeds up, it slows down. Under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, the story slows down to focus on those events which are of the greatest significance as far as God is concerned. And that's why Jacob's journey is all but done by the time we reach chapter 29. Yes, some of the wild animals might have been fascinating, but as far as God is concerned, there's far more important things for us to know about. And the first thing that we see as Jacob reaches the end of his journey is in verses 1 to 14. And there we see the overruling of a sovereign God. The overruling of a sovereign God. Now, unlike Portillo and Palin, Jacob didn't have a Bradshaw's Guide or a Phileas Fogg novel to base his travels on. And he didn't have a GPS or a sat-nav either. He simply walked and walked and walked. Well, those ancient people, they were clever people. They were geniuses at using such things as the sun and the moon for their navigation. But such methods, primitive methods, they only enabled you to know the rough direction of travel. And they could never allow you to say with confidence the exact place that you were in. Do you realize that some GPS devices today can locate your position to within a centimetre of where you are on the planet? A centimetre. No such technology in Jacob's day, and yet he has somehow managed to arrive in the land of the eastern peoples, verse 1. And on his arrival there, he sees a well in the field, verse 2, with 3 flocks of sheep lying near it. For a weary traveller in a Middle Eastern country, the sight of a well was always a welcome sight. And so he goes over and he asks the shepherds, verse 4, "My brothers, where are you from?" Now, don't forget the significance of his question. Don't forget that Jacob doesn't have a GPS location. And so their answer to his question will indicate where he is. Those of you who are younger might not appreciate that, but because you've got all your technology and you know exactly where you are. But some of us who are older remember going on car journeys in places that we had never been before, and you tended to get lost. And so you would say to the person in the passenger seat, "Roll down the window and ask this man where we are." And that's how you discovered where you were. And so that's, in a sense, what Jacob is going to discover. He's going to discover where he is. And therefore, that will tell him how accurate his navigational skills have been. For example, if these shepherds say, "Oh, pleased to meet you, we're from Jerusalem," then he knows he's got another 450 miles to walk. If they say, "Oh, yes, it's great seeing you, we're from Johannesburg," then he knows he's been walking in the wrong direction for the last month and a half. And if they say, "We're from Jupiter," then he knows he's on a different planet. But they don't say any of those things. Instead, they say, verse 4, "We're from Haran." Can you imagine the sense of relief that Jacob must have felt when he heard them say that? We're from Haran. Of all the places on the planet or other planets that he could have been, he's in Haran. The very place that he set out 500 miles ago for in chapter 28, verse 10. He's there. And on hearing that, you may be thinking to yourself, well, why don't we ditch our technology and go back to relying on the sun and the moon for our navigation? If such ancient methods can get Jacob to the precise location in the middle of nowhere, then who needs technology? Well, you can ditch your technology if you want, but don't call me for help when you get completely lost. And you can be sure that you will get lost, because it's not the sun or the moon that's got Jacob all the way to Haran. It's the overruling of a sovereign God. But then that's not the end of the story, because having heard these men say that they are from Haran, he asked them another question, verse 5. "You don't by any chance know a man called Laban, do you?" "Yes," they say in reply. "Yes, we do." "Is he well?" "Yes, he is. And what is more, here comes his daughter Rachel with the sheep." And on seeing Rachel with her sheep, Laban urges the local shepherds to water their flocks there and then. They say they can't until all the flocks from the locality are gathered, and then they'll move the stone from the top of the well and water the sheep. The reason they need to wait for all the flocks were probably because they needed the help of all the shepherds to move the very large stone. Now, how genuine that was and how much of an excuse that was, we don't know. But what Jacob knows is that now is his golden opportunity to impress this young, beautiful daughter of his uncle Laban. And so he does the macho thing, and he goes over and moves the large stone all by himself. Those local shepherds, they're waiting till there's a football team of them in order to move the stone. Jacob goes and moves it by himself, and he waters his uncle's sheep. Having done that, he then kissed her, verse 11, told her who he was, verse 12. She ran off and told her father, and on hearing the news, Laban runs out to meet Jacob, embraced him and kissed him, and brought him to his home. What a story, what a story. Don't forget, Jacob didn't just leave his home bound for a town called Haran. He left home bound for his uncle Laban's house in Haran, and he left home with a view to getting a wife from among his uncle Laban's daughters. And although he's not quite married yet, by the middle of verse 14, he's sitting in his uncle Laban's house in the town of Haran, feet up at the fire, having already met and having already made a huge impression on one of his daughters. Even if Jacob had the latest GPS technology that could have got him within a centimetre of that well, such technology could do nothing to bring Laban's daughter out to cross his path and bring him to where he is in verse 14. The latest technology could never do that. But what the latest technology could never do, a sovereign God can do. Although there's no mention of God in these verses, did you notice that? No mention of God. What you see written all over the story is the hand, the overruling hand of a sovereign God. And do you know he's still the same sovereign, overruling God today? Is that not the point that Jesus is making in Matthew chapter 10, verse 29? When he says to his disciples, "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny?" Now you do the maths, and you'll come to the conclusion that although they were eaten as a delicacy in those days, that means a sparrow was worth about half a pence. And yet, says Jesus, not one of those sparrows will fall to the ground. Not just apart from the knowledge of your Father, not one of those sparrows will fall to the ground apart from the will of your Father. In spite of their relative insignificance, half a pence, in spite of their relative insignificance, God is ruling over the affairs of the sparrow to the extent that they won't drop out of the sky until it is his will for them to do so. That's how much a sovereign God is at work in the life and the experience of a sparrow. And so that being the case, says Jesus to his disciples in verse 31, don't you be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows. In other words, says Jesus, if God is exercising his sovereignty in the experience of a half-pence sparrow, you can be sure that he's exercising his sovereignty in your experience and mine. Well, that doesn't mean that life will always be a breeze. And that doesn't mean that trials or even tragedies won't cross our path. But what it does mean is that our lives on this earth are not left to the impersonal forces of chance or coincidence, as many within our world would believe. The circumstances of your life tomorrow are not determined by fatalism. The circumstances of your life tomorrow are not determined by astrology. Imagine living in such a world as that. How scary would it be? Thankfully, as Jesus said, we don't need to be afraid of the future, because we can be confident that the circumstances of tomorrow and the circumstances of next week and next month and next year are ordered by a sovereign God who considers us much more precious than many sparrows. As we sang a few minutes ago, O God of Bethel, by whose hand thy people still are fed, who through this weary pilgrimage hast all our fathers led, through each perplexing path of life, our wandering footsteps guide. Give us each day our daily bread, and raiment fit provide. O spread thy covering wings around, till all our wandering cease, and at our Father's loved abode our souls arrive in peace. And that is something we can be sure of as the people of God, because of the overruling of our sovereign God. Secondly, moving on, verses 15 to 27, and there we see the discipline of a loving God. The discipline of a loving God. Now, the fact that Jacob was able to move that massive stone at the well by himself, single-handed, suggests that he was a reasonably strong guy, and therefore someone who would be very useful to have around on the farm. And by the time we get to verse 15, Jacob has been helping out on the farm for a month now, and so we hear his uncle Laban say to him, look, he says, just because you're a relative of mine, I don't want to take a loan of you. I don't want to abuse the situation. Just because you're a relative of mine, should you work for me for nothing? Tell me what your wages should be. No need of the trade unions in that situation. The boss simply says, you tell me and I'll pay you. Now, it so happened that the girl that Jacob had met out at the well, she was the youngest of Laban's two daughters. The older one was called Leah, and although the NIV says in verse 17 that she had weak eyes, it's perhaps better to understand that as being soft eyes or delicate eyes, and therefore was perhaps a compliment rather than a weakness. But although Leah had the nice eyes, Rachel, it seems, was the more beautiful of the two, and surprise, surprise, it's Rachel that Jacob has fallen in love with. And so in response to his uncle's question, he says, well, if you want to pay me, I've got a suggestion. I'll work for you 7 years in return for your younger daughter, Rachel. There's a deal, eh? Now, such a deal might sound very strange to us. Living in a modern Western society, it might sound a very strange arrangement, but we mustn't forget that back then in those cultures, the groom's family were usually expected to pay a dowry or a bride price in order to obtain a wife for their son. And as far as we know, Isaac and Rebekah, they sent their son Jacob off to find a wife, but as far as we know, they sent him off without one. Without the bride price, or if they did give him one, he spent it on sweets during his long journey. Either way, he's not got a bride price, and so he's going to have to work for his wife. And apparently, Jacob's 7 years of hard graft on the farm would have been about double the amount. It would have equated to double the amount that would normally have been expected. Double. But that's what love does to a young man. And because he loved her, those 7 years, they passed in a flash. Verse 20 says, they felt like a few days. Few days. And at the end of the 7 years, he goes to his uncle Laban and says, verse 21, give me my wife, my time is completed, and I want to lie with her. And so Laban arranges a wedding, puts on a great feast. It goes on a bit longer than planned, as these things tend to do. And so by the end of the reception, it's pitch dark. No electric light bulbs, remember. It's pitch dark. And so what does Laban do? Verse 23. He took his daughter Leah and gave her to Jacob. And Jacob lay with her. And needless to say, when morning came, and it was daylight, Jacob got the shock of his life. There lying beside him was Leah rather than Rachel. Not surprisingly, Jacob immediately knocks on Uncle Laban's door and says, verse 25, what is this you've done to me? I served you for Rachel, didn't I? Why have you deceived me? And in reply, Laban says, it's not our custom here to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older one. Finish this daughter's bridal week, then we will give you the younger one also in return for another 7 years' work. Now, as you probably know, if you've been watching the news over recent days, you'll know that with only a few days to go before the World Cup started, the hosts changed the rules on the sale of alcohol. And the response of many people was this: look, if that's the rules, then fine. But why didn't you tell us that earlier, i.e. 12 years ago, rather than 2 days before the tournament starts? And you can just imagine Jacob saying a similar thing to Laban. If it's not your custom to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older one, then fine. But why didn't you tell me that much earlier? Why didn't you tell me that 7 years ago, rather than the day after my wedding? What a crafty character you've been, Uncle Laban. Why have you deceived me? You cannot help but feel sorry for Jacob. You cannot help but feel sorry for him. But then as you're feeling sorry for him, you cannot help but think that some of this sounds vaguely familiar. For example, someone deceiving someone else. Does that ring any bells? Back in chapter 27, verse 36, we read of Esau, Jacob's brother, saying about Jacob, he has deceived me these 2 times. He took my birthright, and now he's taken my blessing. And so Jacob has done his fair share of deceiving over the years. And what is interesting is that his deceiving has been over the very same thing, i.e. the rights of the older child over the younger one. Just as Laban has deceived Jacob concerning the right of the older daughter to get married first, so Jacob had deceived both Isaac, his father, and Esau, his brother, over the right of the older son to receive the father's blessing. However much sympathy we have for Jacob, it sounds as if Jacob is now getting a dose of his own medicine. Does it not? The deceiver has now been deceived. And although two wrongs don't make a right, you cannot help but think that this is happening to Jacob in order to let him know how it feels to be deceived. Although there is no mention of God, still no mention of God in these verses, it seems that God is teaching Jacob some very hard lessons. Lessons that ought to change him. Lessons that ought to change him for the good. And did you know that is something which God has continued to do in the life and the experience of his people down throughout history? He has continued. When we go astray, when we go wrong, he has continued to teach us lessons, sometimes difficult lessons. For example, many years after this event, we read of Solomon addressing his son, and here is what he said, Proverbs 3, verse 11, "My son, do not despise the Lord's discipline. Do not resent his rebuke, because the Lord disciplines those he loves. As a father, the son he delights in." And just in case we attempted to dismiss all of that as an Old Testament view of God, the writer to the Hebrews, writing to New Testament Christians, quotes those very same verses from Proverbs 3 and describes them as a word of encouragement. And you might be thinking to yourself, how can verses about discipline and all the rest of it, how can that possibly be a word of encouragement? They're a word of encouragement, says the writer to the Hebrews, because such discipline is an indication that God is treating us as his children. We've all had human fathers who disciplined us and we respected them for it. How much more should we submit to the Father of our spirits and live? Our fathers disciplined us for a little while as they thought best, but God disciplines us for our good, that we may share in his holiness. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. You don't need to tell Jacob that. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. That is what God is doing in the life of Jacob in chapter 29. And that is what God continues to do in the lives of his people. Rather than just leave us, rather than just leave Jacob to go on being a deceiving, cunning character for the rest of his life, God is teaching him some lessons. And likewise, rather than just leave us to go our own reckless way, and rather than just abandon us to perpetually do our own stupid thing, our God steps in and he rebukes us. He humbles us by enabling us to see the error of his ways. And yes, his rebuke can be difficult and painful at times, as Jacob is discovering, but what we must never forget is the goal that God has in view as he disciplines us. Do you remember what the writer to the Hebrews said? He does so that we may share in his holiness. He does so that we might change in character. He does so that we might become more like Jesus, his son and our elder brother. He does so for our good. And we must never forget that in doing so, God is demonstrating his love for us. God is showing us that he's treating us as his children. That is the discipline of a loving God. Moving on, thirdly and finally, verses 28 to 30, and there we see the knock-on effects of disobeying God. The knock-on effects of disobeying God. Having returned from one honeymoon, the one with Leah, Jacob went through another wedding ceremony and then went off on a second honeymoon, and this time with the woman he had intended to marry all along, and that was Rachel. Can you imagine the awkward atmosphere when he and Rachel return home from their honeymoon and have to adjust to living as a threesome? It was an awkwardness that is highlighted by those words in verse 30. Jacob lay with Rachel also, and he loved Rachel more than Leah. Or perhaps better translated, he loved Rachel rather than Leah. What a tragic situation. What a sad situation this young woman, Leah, finds herself in. And it's one which would persist throughout the remainder of her life. And why? Why is she in that situation? Well, whatever blame we may want to attribute to Jacob on this occasion, I think we can safely say that it was through no fault of Leah's that she's in this situation. It's through no fault of Leah that she's suffering as she did. As far as we know, it was never Leah's intention to share a husband with her sister. And so it would be wrong to lay the blame for this tragic situation at her door. It would be wrong to accuse Leah of sin. But having said that, I think we can say that this tragic situation that she finds herself in was the result of sin. We can say that because, to quote those words of Jesus in Matthew 19 that I quoted this morning, it was not this way from the beginning. And so how was it in the beginning? What was God's original plan for the marriage relationship? Well, a little earlier in that Matthew 19 passage, Jesus says this. He says, at the beginning, the Creator made them male and female and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two, not the three, the two will become one flesh. So they're no longer two, but one. That is how it was in the beginning. That is how the marriage relationship was designed in the first place. And yet what you discover time and time again throughout Old Testament history is littered with it. What you find time and time again is that when women deviated from God's intention and God's design and God's original marriage plan, it led to sad and tragic and miserable situations, such as we see in the experience of Leah. What you see on this occasion is Leah suffering, not the consequences of her own sin. You see Leah suffering the knock-on effects of man's disobedience generally. And sadly, such effects still occur today. Living in a fallen world as we do, as Leah did, we sometimes suffer the consequences not just of our own sin, but we sometimes suffer the consequences of man's sin in a more general sense. We do so because following man's disobedience in the Garden of Eden, the very earth was cursed by its creator, and as a result, life in this world became difficult. It became difficult. Sickness and sadness, tragedy, disease and death would now be a feature of life in a fallen world. And as you read through the Bible, both Old and New Testaments, you discover that God's people are not exempt. God's people are not exempt from those devastating knock-on effects of man's disobedience. As the people of God, we too may know what it is to suffer sadness and misery in life, as Leah has on this occasion. As the people of God, we too may know what it is to pass through times of sadness and darkness, as we were reminded from Psalm 88 a few weeks ago. As the people of God, we too may know what it is to experience tragedy, as we see in the experience of Job. Those are just some of the knock-on effects of man's disobedience. And you know as well as I do that they're very much a reality of life in this world. And what we also know from several thousand years of history is that no political system and no philosophical theory and no economic strategy can sufficiently address those issues so as to eradicate them from our experience of life in this world. They can't do it. And yet the great news of the Bible is that in his redeeming work upon the cross, Jesus has not only rescued us from the frightening and eternal consequences of our own sin. That is great in and of itself. What he has also done is he has rescued us and redeemed us from the consequences of man's sin in general. He has done so not by removing us from such experiences in the here and now, but he has done so by securing for us an eternity in a new creation, where the devastating effects of man's disobedience and the subsequent curse on the former creation will be forever banished. Can you imagine that? He has secured for us an eternity where there will be none of the sadness that you see in the experience of Leah. He has secured for us an eternity where there will be none of the darkness that you read of in the experience of the psalmist. He has secured for us an eternity where there will be none of the tragedy that you see in the experience of Job. That is the glorious prospect. The glorious prospect that belongs to those who are trusting in Jesus Christ. And therefore, if the misery and suffering and tragedy that we see and we experience as a result of living in a fallen world, if what we see and what we experience of that ought to have any effect upon us, as the people of God, it ought to make us long for that coming day when all that sadness and all that darkness and all that disease and all that death and all that tragedy will be forever a thing of the past. What we see around us and what we experience of life in this fallen world, it ought to make us long for that coming day. It ought to make us pray as John did. Amen. Come, Lord Jesus. Three things we see in Genesis 29. Firstly, we see the overruling of a sovereign God. Secondly, we see the discipline of a loving God. And thirdly, we see the knock-on effects of disobeying God.